One of the most beautifully contemporary films released during the 2010s, aesthetically, narratively, and cerebrally. Liu Ye has been directing films for some time now, and spectacular films at that. The fact that 2018's Cloud in the Wind, aka The Shadow Play, might be his finest is really saying quite a lot. Whilst I can state a lot about the direction of Liu Ye and how he commands the photographic skills of one Jake Pollock, truly so much credit must be given to perhaps the most impressive, invigorating, and flat out intelligent screenplay realised in the 2010s or 21st century thus far. I'm under the impression that He Yuji was the initial author of this screenplay. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name as well as I ought to be. And then it was touched up by Meng Fei and Ma Ying Li, two frequent screenwriting collaborators of Liu Ye's. Cloud in the Wind is Qi Yuji's first film credit of any kind, whereas Meng Fei had worked on the screenplays for Liu Ye's Summer Palace, Spring Fever, and Mystery. Ma Yingli had written, also for Liu Ye, Blind Massage and Saturday Fiction, as well as being credited for working on Summer Palace's script. And if I'm not mistaken, Meng Fei directed a fantastic film in 2016 called Mr. No One, something like that. Really quite strong film. These three talents came together and have delivered one of the most powerful film screenplays of all time, an intricate mix of corporate espionage, real estate corruption, family affairs, emotional blackmail, stressed justice, and scarcity of truth in the age of information. And Liu Ye was gifted with the opportunity to direct it, because who could have done it better? Who else would have dared? Liu Ye has a history of directing films considered controversial in China, as they have tended to depict, with a certain candidness, spaces and times in recent Chinese history which can or do invoke harsh political critiques. 2000's Suzhou River might not be seen as a political film, although its frank portrayal of lower economic material existence was not very welcome in a state whose party line dictated an extinguishing of any and all class distinctions. 2006's Summer Palace was more explicit, relaying the experiences of the generation which came of age during and amongst the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989. Of course, Cloud in the Wind was no stranger to controversy either. Its willingness to include forced evictions as part of its plot was not to be unnoticed in China, and although the film was ultimately permitted to be released, it had initially been intended to premiere during 2016 instead. Liu Ye's films don't strike me as overtly political, or rather, he doesn't strike me as a political filmmaker outright. Rather someone who, in exploring the ethical human concerns of his zeitgeist, inevitably comes into controversy with the ruling establishment, but even they cannot deny his latent wisdom, admit his impartial vision, and subsequently sigh in shame. I have seen this film described online as a neo-noir, and while that is apt, do be careful not to reduce this film to such, simply because its plot can mildly resemble one. For those who are not aware, this plot's gravity is a young police officer investigating the suicide of a construction executive, although its substantive investigation is where this film becomes much more than a mystery of murder, and an exploration into the origins of human corruption period. Why do institutions and establishments contain an inherent inevitability of corruption and deceit? Feelings of inadequacy, emptiness, distrust, fear, whatever we want to name, Yang Xiaodong is investigating the motivation of a suicide, but also learns what motivates any manipulation of the truth in the first place. You might groan, but let's be realistic. This film certainly is. It is the consequences of love. What one would do in a response to the loss of a loved one, or the loss of that loved one's love, is so much of what motivates human greed, distrust, and malevolence. But now I must wax some verbal on this film's cinematographic philosophy. Why does Pollock's camera feel so contemporary? It seamlessly moves through filmic perspectives, extreme mobile phone angle close-ups, the majesty of the traditional staged close-up, striking and communicative wide shots, and then these lavish landscape photography, or rather, cityscape photography, to be specific. We receive a firm grasp of the narrative's brevity, where its events sit in the context of a wider, systematic industrial cycle. This is like the best 21st century Michael Mann film, which Michael Mann himself is not talented enough to deliver. I think this film really takes advantage of the fact that film art has really overcome the initial rigidity of the camera, which we could say plagued the silent era and film productions up until very recently. Handheld cameras are of a very, let's say, shoddy quality when they were first unleashed into the market in the 1980s, and now they are, it's just phenomenal. I think a lot of what a lot of the cameras utilized for this film were handheld, certainly for the sequences where the shots, the frames moving about through crowds of people, and it resembles, aesthetically, it resembles, news footage sometimes. Cameras on the ground where the protests are taking place. I think a lot of that was deliberate. It wants to take place in the world where the media takes place, and it wants to fuse the reality of human perception of events around them and that kind of coalescing unified media vision of an environment of the world where those aforementioned people interact, where those two things meet. I think we may call that Liu Ye's film Cloud in the Wind. It's a lofty statement, but I do believe that Cloud in the Wind is one of the 50 greatest films ever made, I assume, and anyone who thinks cinema is not in a good place, those people are just so evidently wrong.